What's going on, everybody? I'm here with a lens review today. We're going to be comparing the Tamron 15-30mm with the Rokinon 14mm prime. So the Rokinon, it's a 14mm prime lens, which means it doesn't have zoom capabilities, whereas the Tamron 15-30 can, of course, go from 15mm to 30. So that is like the primary difference. But the reason why I think it's a good comparison is because they both fit the niche of somewhat budget video lenses with autofocus. So for anybody out there who's doing like vlog stuff, these could be two okay choices for you. When I was looking for an ultra-wide lens with autofocus, my first purchase was the Rokinon 14mm because it was a fairly budget choice. I believe when I purchased it, it was about $600 US, which came out to be like 800 Canadian, which isn't cheap. Like this certainly isn't a cheap lens, but it was one of the cheapest I could find that worked on a full frame camera, had autofocus, and had that ultra wide capability. The reason I'm thinking about going to the Tamron instead of the Rokinon is because of the extra perks you get with this being a zoom lens, but you also get the vibration control or image stabilization. And that could be a really big deal for video, but one of the reasons I wanted to do this test is because we're working at such short focal lengths, down as low as 15mm or 14mm, does that image stabilization really make much of a difference? Another big selling point of both of these lenses is the fact that they both stop down to 2.8 aperture as opposed to the standard 4. Now, getting a ultra-wide lens that goes to wide apertures and has autofocus, we're now looking at a very limited field of competitors, right? You can have something like the Canon 16-35, which would be a good option, but hyper expensive. And with that, one of the drawbacks is that you have to choose between either getting the 2.8 aperture or the image stabilization. There's no 16-35 from Canon that has both. So that's kind of a problem. There are some other prime lenses you could get down as low as 14 or even 12mm, but they don't have that autofocus. So if doing like DIY video, like run and gun stuff, is one of your priorities, you kind of need that autofocus, or that's going to be a big problem. A downside of both of these lenses is that they have the built-in like flower petal lens flare cap things, whatever we're going to call these. The issue with this is that neither of these can accept a front filter. And if you need to have an ND filter, or if you want to put on some like creative filters, that's going to be a problem for you. There are some third-party solutions where you can actually mount a filter on the back between your camera and the lens mount itself, but that's getting to be a bit of a hassle. You're going to have to buy an extra like adapter and all that stuff, and it's just a little annoying. So not being able to screw in filters on the front is a bit of a problem if that's one of your priorities. But again, that affects both of these. Now, if we talk about the main differences between these, one we already talked about is the zoom capability of the Tamron. So having the capability to go from 15 to 30 is really helpful. Like if you have a lot of time, if you're making a short film, sure, like primes are great because they're going to get you really good video quality or image quality at the cost of being less flexible. If you are doing run and gun stuff and you want to get some footage quick, you've got like, 40 minutes left on golden hour and you want to make a full video, then having the range from 15 to 30, it's not a huge range, but you can cover a lot of valuable areas with that. So this is a lot more flexible than the Rokinon because of that. And also the image stabilization is a nice plus. One thing that makes the Tamron less flexible is the fact that it is a literal brick. Like this thing, it is 1,100 grams, so more than a kilogram on this thing. it is heavy. And if you are, you know, like holding your GorillaPod, doing some selfie camera stuff, maybe I'm just weak, but the weight of the camera, this 1.1 kilo lens, it just got to be a little bit much, and it kind of negates the image stabilization because like my weak wrists can't handle this weight. But maybe that's a me problem. The Rokinon is under half that weight, 485 grams. You can like toss this around. I'm not going to because I'm not a millionaire. But that it's a lot more. You're able to just sort of throw this in your bag and go. There's a lot less hassle of carrying around a brick in your bag. So for this comparison, I decided to look at 4 different niches that I think that both of these lenses are pretty good at. The first one is astrophotography. We are also going to take a look at its use in real estate photography or architecture photography. Having these ultra-wide lenses is really good for that as well, especially in tight spaces. Another good use of these lenses would be for landscape photography. You know, you don't always have to go wider than a 24mm, but sometimes you do, and in those situations, going down to 14 or 15mm is really nice. And the final one is like a run-and-gun style video test for all of the vloggers out there who are looking for an ultra-wide lens. So after doing the testing, a few things that I found is that pretty much across the board, the Rokinon for image quality is a little bit sharper. This is regardless of if you're up down to 2.8 or an f8. I did tests for both of them, and in both situations, the Rokinon is just a little bit sharper. It also has that extra 1mm of focal length, which when you get down to the really wide lenses, being able to go from a 15 to a 14 is pretty pronounced. When it comes to vignetting around the edges, I would say that both of these lenses do have a bit of a problem with it, but with the Rokinon it is a little more pronounced. In this picture here, we're looking at a interior shot of a bathroom, which is going to be one of those situations that they're usually, you know, they're not always the brightest rooms in the house, and they are also usually a bit smaller than most of the other rooms. So if you're doing real estate photography, this is going to be a really important place to have that 2.8 aperture, but also have an ultra-wide lens. Now you can see in this picture that we get quite a bit more of the room in on the 14mm focal length. In fact, it gets to be even a little bit too much. As you can see at the top, we've got like a bit of that vent in there, and I probably could have adjusted my angle to get that out of there, but sometimes like it just gets so wide that unless you're really careful, you're going to get some things in there that you weren't expecting to see. A consequence of having ultra-wide lenses is that you will often have issues with warping or distortion. Many manufacturers say that they have low or no distortion, but when you get to angles this wide, with the mechanics of, you know, physics and how the glass would have to work for this, it's just impossible not to have a warp. And, you know, it's no fault to the lens for having that warp, it's just a trade-off of being able to go that wide. When we look at these pictures, you can tell that both of them do have some distortion at the edges of the picture. I would say that the Rokinon one has a little bit more of a warp to it. It's especially pronounced in this picture of the bathroom. If you look near the sink, in the real world, the distance on the edges of the sink between the wall and between the edge of the counter are equal, but because of the distortion on the Rokinon lens, you can see that the edge on the right towards the wall is quite a bit longer. Like I said, it's just a consequence of being this wide, but if being as faithful to the real situation as you can be is important, then maybe the Tamron wins a little bit there for having slightly less distortion when you don't have like a perfect camera angle. You can minimize this by always shooting head on instead of at a upwards or downwards angle, but again, this gets to be a bit of an issue if you're in tight spaces trying to not show up in a mirror or in a window reflection or something like that. When it comes to the image stabilization, I really was curious if it was going to make much of a difference between the two lenses, considering we're at such a short focal length. And to be honest, the difference isn't huge. For this comparison, I just went around and I walked around in our fresh new snow, so it is a little bit shakier than it would normally be if you're like walking on a sidewalk or something. I also did a bit of a run in these videos, but you can see that it is a little bit smoother on the Tamron, but it's not a huge deal-breaking difference. I would say that for both of these, personal skill in holding a camera steady is going to be way more impactful than the image stabilization. So for my final thoughts on these, what I am going to keep this Tamron lens because I think that for the niche I need it for, it is performing much better than the Rokinon. I wanted to be able to have that image stabilization. I wanted to be able to have a bit of a zoom. I wanted to be able to do ultra wide, and I wanted to not have to switch my lenses every 5 minutes. But it really depends what you want to do. If you really just want to do things like astrophotography, real estate videos, real estate photography, architecture photography, landscapes, then the Rokinon actually still is not for you. Because the biggest issue with this lens is there is a huge price increase to get the autofocus version of this, and the benefits you get aren't that great. So for a comparison, if you want to get a 14mm Rokinon lens, same brand, same focal length, but you go for the manual focus version, slash that price in half. You're going from like $600 to $300. So if you don't need that autofocus, I would not get this lens. If you do need the autofocus and you want to do run and gun video, then I think that the price increase to the Tamron is worth it. Having said that, if you are in a very specific situation of you need something for video, you need to have autofocus, you also want to have that ultra-wide angle lens, and you need it to work on a full-frame camera, but you can't afford the, I believe it's about a $400 price increase to go to the Tamron, then in that specific circumstance, this lens is for you, the Rokinon 14mm autofocus. The issue I have with the Rokinon is that it is not the best at doing ultra-wide pictures. If you really need to go wide and you want to do interior photography or architecture photography, something like that, then you could go for the Leoya, the 12-meter zero distortion lens, which I've seen a few reviews for. It is not indeed zero distortion, but it is a very nice lens. So if you really want to do astrophotography, you really want to do architecture and real estate photography, then I think that the autofocus is not really a big priority for you, and going from this to that 12mm prime is not going to be a massive price increase. That ends up being about the same price as the Tamron lens. If you can't go for that price increase, again, go to the manual focus versions of the Rokinon. You're going to save about half your money, and it's going to do just as well. So if you're looking at getting the Tamron, the other question you have to ask yourself is, assuming you're using a Canon camera, am I going to go instead for the Canon 16-35? Because that's a really great lens. A lot of people love it, especially for doing this run and gun style video. At that point, you have to ask yourself the question of, how much money do I have? Is 2.8 aperture what I want? Do I want the image stabilization? And does this extra 1mm of focal length matter? Because, like I mentioned earlier, the Canon, you cannot get both the fast 2.8 aperture, and also the image stabilization. You have to choose one. If you go for the image stabilization at f4, that could be a really good option, and it ends up being about the same price as the Tamron. So if you prioritize a little bit sharper of an image over getting that 2.8 aperture, then probably go for the Canon 16-35 f4. If you really want to stop down to f2.8, then you have to compare this with the 2.8 version of the Canon 16-35, and at that point your price has doubled for this. So we go from like $600 to $1,000 to $2,000. The last thing to talk about for this Tamron lens is that there is a new version that has come out for this. This is the first version, but they've recently come out with G2. I have not tested the G2, so I can't really speak for if it helps with that sharpness issue where the Tamron was losing out to the Rokinon, or if it helps with the distortion and the vignetting and all that stuff. But what I can say is that you should look out for deals, because I wish this deal was still on, but I ended up ordering this a little too late. It got here too late for me to make a review video while it was still on sale. But I managed to pick this up on the Canadian Amazon for 1,000 Canadian dollars when its normal price is 1,000 US dollars. So because of that sale, I saved about 25%, which is really significant. I ended up getting the Tamron lens for almost the same price I paid for the Rokinon. So I would say at that price point, it is definitely worth the upgrade for the extra flexibility. What this means for you is that you should look out for sales on the Tamron lens, but you could also look out for people on the third-party markets selling their old gear because they are upgrading to the new one, or just doing upgrades to a different type of lens, something like that. This is a few years old now. It came out in 2015, so you might find one on the secondary market, and it's going to be quite a bit cheaper, so you'll be able to save some money there. I've included links in the description for all of the lenses we've talked about today: the Tamron, the Rokinon, the Leoia, the 16-35s from Canon. All of those are in the description, so check those out if you want to make a purchase. That is where all of those links are. And I've also included links to the raw files for these photo comparisons that I did, so that you can take a look at them in more detail and make an informed decision for yourself. So if you found this video helpful, please hit that subscribe button. It's really helpful for me. If you want to see any more comparisons in the future, let me know and I will see if I can do that. Coming up later this week or early next week, depending on how much free time I find, I'm going to be doing a comparison of two wireless lapel microphones. So that is going to be really cool if you're into audio stuff, or if you just want a nice wireless solution for when you're out getting some video. So let me know what you think in the comments. I'll see you guys next time. Happy shooting.